Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt, and I'm happy to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy for our webinar series. To check the specifics of upcoming topics and speakers, please go to securefreedom.org, and I'll also give you a preview of upcoming events at the end of today's broadcast. Today's program, part of our continuing China series, is entitled Taiwan Invasion, How Would China Do It? To explore various scenarios, including some unconventional ones, we've reconvened two guests who joined us back in February, and we look forward to checking in now 4 months later on this evolving topic. Before proper introductions, let me remind you that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box in the GoToWebinar panel. I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. The event is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as our website, securefreedom.org. Well, yesterday, China reportedly flew a record 28 fighter jets toward Taiwan, the largest such display of force since Beijing began sending planes on a near daily basis last year. But conventional shows of force are just one of many strategies at China's disposal. A full-scale amphibious assault may be less desirable than, for example, stoking a domestic insurgency with limited direct involvement, or a sustained diplomatic and psychological gray zone attacks soften Taiwan's resolve. Our guests today are both senior fellows at the center. Joining us from Japan is Grant Newsham, a research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, focusing on Asia-Pacific defense, political, and economic matters. Newsham is a retired US Marine colonel and was the first US Marine Liaison Officer to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. He also served as research head of intelligence for Marine Forces Pacific and was the US Marine Attaché, US Embassy Tokyo on 2 occasions. Mr. Newsham has worked with the Taiwan Marine Corps over the years and spent 2019 in Taiwan as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs Fellowship, researching Taiwan's defense and how to improve it. Welcome, Grant. Stephen Bryan is a leading expert in security strategy and technology. He's held senior positions in the Department of Defense on Capitol Hill and is the president of a large multinational defense and technology company. Dr. Bryan has 50 years of experience in government and industry. He has served as a senior staff director of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as a deputy undersecretary of defense for trade security policy, and as a commissioner of the US China Security Review Commission. And Steve, you've written in detail about an invasion strategy that involves conventional military forces, but perhaps strategically limited to minor islands controlled by Taiwan, rather than the island of Taiwan itself. Please explain why this might be a more desirable option for Beijing.
Okay, well, thank you for having me again. It's been a while since February, but we're still playing the same games out in the region, just more and more of the same. I was in Taiwan in 1996 in March when the Chinese all but started an invasion of the island. And it took about 2 weeks to get the Clinton administration to finally send some aircraft carrier task forces to the region and frighten off the Chinese from trying it. And everyone knows, it's clear that since then, China has been trying to, first of all, figure out how to overcome US power, because I think that the real problem they have in dealing directly with Taiwan is the United States. And I think that's correct when they're poor. So I was trying to think, what would the Chinese try if they really want to do something and cause some damage to Taiwan, force a change of government perhaps, or at least force a negotiation, concessions that would look a lot like maybe the Hong Kong concessions, or even worse. And the thesis that I've come up with is that they necessarily won't attack directly Taiwan itself, but they will attack Taiwanese possessions. And the most famous one that is on the list is Kinmen, pronounced Jinmen in the Chinese pronunciation. And it's what the Americans called in the past Quemoy, which was the Portuguese name of the island. Kinmen is close, very close to the Chinese mainland. You can see the Chinese city of Xiamen just across the bay. So it's that close. And I'm going to show you a few pictures. which makes it a very inviting target. It's not heavily populated. It's 150,000 people, more or less, and only about 5,000 troops. Now, it's very well revetted. It's got underground caves and very strongly built artillery, but it's very old-fashioned too in the way it's defended. From the Chinese point of view, an attack on Kinmen probably wouldn't provoke a U.S. reaction, much like what happened in the South China Sea, where the U.S. did nothing, absolutely nothing. China grabbed the islands, even after an international court said they didn't own them. They grabbed the islands, they militarized them, they did it day in, day out. And the U.S. said this and that and the other thing, but that was it. Sailed a few ships here and there, but China got away with it 100%. And I think that precedent is something they must be thinking a lot about right now. By taking Kinmen or Jinmen from China would essentially close a historical chapter, and I'll tell you more about it in a bit, when Mao attacked the island in 1949 and lost. The Chinese invasion force was defeated. He thought it was possible to take it, but it failed. By having Jinmen, China could put an awful lot of pressure on Taiwan, and would, and may try to force a change in government to put a more friendly government. Try to test the proposition that the Taiwanese really don't want to fight. And if they're going to lose things and get squeezed, they may just decide it ain't worth it. And even if that didn't come about, they would still have Jinmen, and they could then militarize it just like they militarized the reefs and the islands in the South China Sea. So they would just add to their capability. Can we get the next slide, please? Adam, this is the Jinmen Quemoy islands. There's a number of them. There's Erdan, Dadan, very little ones, lesser Kinmen, and then the main island itself. Okay, the next slide. And that's the main town in Jinmen. It's a pleasant town. It's not very big, but that's what it looks like. You can see China, those mountains in the back, that's China. Okay, next slide. This is interesting. This is Xiu, which is an islet. It's owned by Taiwan, and you can see at the bottom of this little rock pile, the Taiwanese flag stuck in there, looking in the wrong direction, unfortunately. Should be facing the other way. And behind it is the city of Xiamen, the Chinese city. So you can see the proximity. There's no proximity at all. Next slide. And this is one of the smaller islands, Daodan. It's basically a very almost uninhabited place. Next one. And these are Taiwanese pilots with their home-built FCK-1 fighter, which is their domestic jet. Next slide. Okay, let's go back to history. 1949, Battle of Guningtao. Guningtao is a beach. If you can just go right to the next slide, please. Okay, this is what it looked like, the invasion in 1949. This tries to show you the Chinese troops coming in. Basically, what happened was that Mao thought that he could grab Jinmen and humiliate Chiang Kai-shek, who was in Taiwan, and essentially hoped that the local forces there, which he was subsidizing, would crush the nationalists. They were called the Nationalist Army, the ROK today, ROC today. Unfortunately for the Chinese, the invasion didn't work out. They sent about 9,000 troops in on essentially two beaches, about an 8 or 9 mile stretch, right where you see those arrows in the diagram. Next slide, please.
You know, Steve, maybe let's go back just for 1 second to the
to show where they're located.
Yeah, it's so close to the coast.
You can see Jinmen is just right up against China. In 1960, you may recall that President, actually neither one was president at that point, Kennedy and Nixon, I guess Nixon was vice president, and they were debating for the presidential election, where Kennedy said you couldn't defend Kinmen. And Nixon said you must, both Kinmen and Matsu. Matsu's a rock pile. It's not worth really a discussion. But in any case, this just gives you a quick description of the battle. I'm not going to concentrate. I'll just go to the next slide. I'm going to skip all the details. I just want to point out that this was the main. There were 22 of these tanks that the nationalists had on Jinmen in 1949, and these tanks turned out. I mean, these are not great tanks, but it turns out they were extraordinarily effective. Even one of them that was stuck in the sand on the beach and couldn't move was still able to shoot invasion boats. These were wooden boats at the time. They're no longer wooden, but they were able to knock them out and do quite a lot of damage to the invading Chinese Communist forces. Next slide. And here's some of the prisoners that were taken by the nationalists. The original thought that Mao had was that there weren't that many troops on Jinmen. Taiwan wouldn't be able to reinforce in time to stop the successful invasion. And he also believed, and by the way, I have a feeling they still believe it, that the Taiwanese wouldn't fight. He thought they would just throw their arms up in the air. It actually worked the other way around, where the Chinese troops were the ones throwing their arms up in the air, and the Taiwanese did fight and fought pretty hard. They killed 2,000, at least 2,000 troops from China in this invasion. So for historical reasons, it would seem to me that this would be attractive to the Chinese because it would right a wrong, if you want, to prove that Mao was just ahead of his time, because they could do this pretty easily, it would seem. It's far enough from Taiwan and it's because of the number of airplanes and missiles the Chinese could use. I mean, the Taiwanese would have very great difficulty reinforcing Jinmen in a battle. But the real item here of most importance is, what would the United States do? And it's my contention that the United States would be caught in a very difficult position for two reasons. One is not much we could do. It's right against China. How are we going to do that? We're not ready for that sort of thing. We're not prepared. And I don't think we could even be prepared. So that's a huge problem, which would then give aid and comfort to the Chinese, who say, okay, well, why don't we do it? Would give us something to show our own people that we've been successful. We've shown these guys that we mean business. We're not going, this is our land and we want it back. It's time for the Taiwanese to sit down with us and make a deal and stop this independence stuff. And you know, and we're trapped. We're out of the game. So that's why I think it's, I mean, I don't like the right Chinese strategy, but and I'm not sure it is even their strategy, but but at least it has those merits, and we have to keep that in mind, and we have to think of countermeasures. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. I think that's illuminating, and I think just that visual alone of the photo as well as the map, I think not a lot of people are aware that Taiwanese possessions are that close to the mainland, and provides an interesting strategic problem. So Grant, you recently wrote really a fascinating paper for the center. You pointed to Russia's unconventional strategies in eastern Ukraine and how they might be applied to China with respect to Taiwan. Please give us a tour of potential similarities as well as differences. What might that actually look like if transferred to East Asia?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Now, when you hear the words China invades Taiwan, it conjures up a different image, I think, for most people. One of the common images is something like a D-Day or a full-scale assault of an Iwo Jima sort. That's always a possibility, and we'll get to that later. But there's another part that I wanted to consider, and that was given the Chinese preference for subversion, political warfare, could they have do something like Vladimir Putin did in the Ukraine, where he basically took over the eastern part of the country. If you could show the slide, please.
Oh.
And he took over a part that's called the Donbas region, and it's the very easternmost part. And what he did is he basically said, well, it's just unhappy locals who don't like the Ukrainian government. And as for these little green men in tanks, well, who knows where they came from? And so he got it through a combination of stealth, force, and a lot of chutzpah, which he's got plenty of. But Putin had some real advantages when he was doing this. One is he shares a land border with Ukraine with the Donbas region, so that makes it easier to operate. Also, in the local population, there was actually a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet era, largely owing to economic troubles that they had. There's also a large Russian-speaking population. And Putin also had fifth columnists throughout the Ukrainian government and the military, and he thought he was going to be able to get all the way to Kiev, way over in the west. To his great surprise, the Ukrainian defense coalesced, and he was stalled in the Donbas region. But he still got he still has that region. The government of Ukraine does not control it. And also, Putin had just before going into Donbas, he had seized Crimea down at the bottom of the slide from Ukraine. He had done that and gotten away with it. So what I was trying to think of is, could the Chinese try to do something like that with Taiwan, and particularly the island of Formosa, the main island, not the little ones that Stephen just talked about. So what are China's prospects for a Donbas sort of strategy? Well, as I said, they've got there's some troubles here. Partly, you don't have a land border. There's a 100-mile ocean that you have to get across. Additionally, Taiwan's a really big place. It's about 14,000 square miles. And if you've been to Hawaii, the big island of Hawaii, which is big, is only 4,000 square miles. But also, the Chinese timing is not very good. If they had tried it maybe 6 years ago or earlier, it would have been better for them. There's always been a lot of pro-China, pro-unification politicians in Taiwan. The president before the current one, President Ma, from 2008 to 2016, there's people that thought he actually wanted to engineer annexation with the PRC. And there were some real doubts as to whether or not he really wanted to defend Taiwan. Also, there's plenty of pro-PRC people in Taiwan's academia, in religious groups, even community organizations. The subversion has worked pretty well. Media, there's some just seem like Chinese mouthpieces. And in the business world, there's a lot of people who do business in China and are effectively pro-PRC. And even back then, even younger Taiwanese many of them saw the future as China. That was largely owing to a very weak Taiwanese economy, didn't look like there were prospects, thought they could get jobs in China. And also, there's always been no shortage of spies in Taiwan. So if Xi Jinping had played his hand better, he just might have had a sort of a better environment and an opening for a Donbas sort of approach. But he just couldn't help himself, sort of like a fat man at the buffet. He just can't stop. And what he did is he scared enough Taiwanese to the point that a Donbas got much harder. It'd be very hard to pull that off today. So what is the situation today? Well, there is, of course, a substantial fifth column in Taiwan. It's had decades to set it up, the Chinese have. And you think about it, and it's easy to put people in place, transport to and from Taiwan's easy. Also, moving hardware is not that difficult. And hardware can be communications equipment, explosives, weapons. That too, not very hard. There's well-established smuggling networks between Taiwan and the mainland. Organized crime has a big presence in Taiwan. A lot of that is pro-PRC. And there's even one Taiwanese port which has a reputation for being very friendly for that sort of activity. So there's a possibility that if called upon, this fifth column in Taiwan could go into action in support of a more conventional assault, sort of assassinations, attacking key targets, etc., and maybe even grabbing an airfield or a port or two, which would allow you to bring in, to flow in other forces. But a fifth column is one thing, and breaking down Taiwan government control of an area is another. And seizing control of that area and occupying it. That's a very different thing, and I don't think the Chinese could do that yet. The possibility of putting guerrillas up, sort of into operation in Taiwan, say up in the mountains, that too would be problematic. They might survive for a little while, but it's a hard place to sustain yourself, and say the Taiwan Marine and Army reconnaissance recruit heavily from the indigenous populations, and they might enjoy the opportunity to practice and get some heads. Also, you just won't have the public support for it, particularly not among the younger Taiwanese, who really they've come to really have no interest in being dominated or controlled by the PRC. Among the older generation, they're less opposed, and there are some people who wouldn't mind unification, but being the old generation, there's less and less of them as time passes. It is really the Hong Kong experience in the last couple of years that really woke people up and turned more people in Taiwan just dead set against the idea of PRC unification. There are, of course, still plenty of pro-China politicians, some of them keeping quiet, most of them in the KMT, some are independent, and also in the media, there's still pro-Chinese factions, and also this lower level subversion that I mentioned still exists, academia as well, the business community. So there is something to work with, but it's not what it was 6-7 years ago. It's had to kind of lay low. So the DPP, the current ruling party, which does not want to be part of China, is in the ascendancy. So I would say that a long-term, slow-moving occupation of the Donbass sort is unlikely. And just geography works against it, the state of the population works against it as well, and political conditions are unfavorable. And there's really no part of Formosa where there's such opposition to the Taiwan state, to the government, that would allow them to establish a no-go zone. And also the Taiwanese police and the army, the military, is still able to sort of hammer anyone who tries to do that. So at most, I would say that for now, a short-term control of a small area, say a port or an airfield in particular, to support a larger amphibious and multi-pronged assault, that is probably feasible, but not a sort of a Donbass sort of effort of the sort that Putin would recognize. As for the offshore islands, that would be a little easier. In some cases, there's some local affinity for the PRC, in historical ties, and there may be something to work with. Just concoct a provocation, just say the locals invited us, or take advantage of a typhoon that comes through, saying we're just coming to help for humanitarian reasons. That's a possibility, but I think if China does that, they've showed their hand. And that just might stiffen spines elsewhere in Taiwan, but also in the region and around the world. And so China could face some other pressure if it were to do that. But as for future prospects of a Donbass in Taiwan, it's always worth remembering that circumstances change. Just the political situations change, the way people think changes, and often it happens pretty quickly. And so if the PRC could create economic turmoil, psychological intimidation, create a sense of hopelessness, fear, etc., and weaken the will to resist, and then combine that with military encroachments of the sort we see all the time, then it may have a more favorable environment. Also, there's always a possibility of sort of using Chinese maritime militia and the fishing fleet to create almost a Donbass at sea. You just swarm places close to Taiwan with enough ships, maritime militia, and maybe even put people ashore at some point and tell Taiwan to stand clear. that is a scenario. And you do if you can do this, if China could do this with a different, more pliable government, not today's government, but with a different one, well, they just might acquiesce into what China would try to do. And in the future, not right now, it is possible. Some analysts say that a coalition of pro-PRC officials, KMT members, pro-PRC academics, business leaders, United Front people, just might call for the PRC to enter Taiwan under, say, the guise of HADR or something else, or even worse, elections do turn out differently than you think, and if a CCP, a Chinese puppet, were to be voted in, that would be very, very serious. That almost happened in 2020 when Han Kuo-yu, the KMT, had a shot at winning. And also, if the military continues to stay weak and a little bit demoralized, that creates a favorable environment. The lack of a decent reserve force, the lack of a civil defense operation as well, it creates a sense of hopelessness or isolation, and that too is problematic. But that is how things could develop in the future that might make a Donbass realistic. But so you have to be careful. But ultimately, it comes down to the question, I think, of is Taiwan going to be left to fend for itself? And all that tracks back to Washington, D.C. For now, it seems that Taiwan does have American support, and that does have a bracing effect inside Taiwan. And also a Donbass response, a response to something like a Donbass, would be a little bit easier for the U.S. With Taiwan than it was with Ukraine. Most people in the American foreign policy community didn't know much about Ukraine, and they do about Taiwan. Also, America has bases in the area and has been operating there for a long time. But I would say that if the United States is distracted, disinterested, frightened, or if it allows the military imbalance to develop such that the American military cannot move to support Taiwan without getting slaughtered or hit very hard to the point that we just can't move, that would change the entire dynamic. And then you might see the PRC is more willing to aggressively coerce Taiwan, ruin the economy, terrorize and demoralize the public, and beef up its fifth column and sympathizers and put them to work. And at that point, you just might see a Donbass become more feasible. But for now, I think it would be a long shot for the Chinese. But in the future, you have to be careful.